The arrival of the miners, the empire building of the cattle ranchers, the dispersal of the Indian tribes, all serve as a prelude to a massive movement of farmers into the Plains region.
More land was brought under cultivation in the United States. Between 1870 and 1900, than in all of American and colonial history prior to that. The most dramatic growth came on the eastern Great Plains, where this agricultural economy that was so well developed in the American Midwest spread across the Mississippi River, across the Missouri River, into Kansas and Nebraska, into South Dakota, into Iowa, into those regions. The beginning of cultivation of grains. But farming was also booming elsewhere throughout the West during these years. It was booming in the interior West in areas that were developed to feed these new centers of population, the mining towns. It was developing in Utah around Salt Lake. It was booming in California. It was developing in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. So agriculture was developing in many different parts of the West. It developed very rapidly with the aid of the new technology of agriculture, and of course the aid of the railroad.
Just a few years earlier, such rapid agricultural growth would have seemed unlikely.
Lots of the soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 80s rode home and they asked, "We don't know why we're fighting this war. This land is not going to be land that anyone is going to want." Americans were used to evaluating the quality of land based on the quality of trees that grew upon it, which is not an accurate way of understanding the fertility of soils. But the Great Plains had no trees on it. And so it was called by an early expedition the Great American Desert, and that term remained on maps of the United States well into the 19th century.
The interior far west has an environment that is one of the most unpredictable and erratic in the Western Hemisphere. For example, in an area of the plains that has an average annual rainfall of 15 inches, that might mean 20 or 22 inches one year, and it might mean 7 inches the next. A very risky business. During the early years of this great agricultural boom on the plains went through one of its periodic wet cycles. So, by good luck, it rained a good bit more than usual.
People began to farmstead on this land. They were given generous grants of land on either side of the railroad tracks. In fact, 10 miles in a checkerboard pattern on either side of their right-of-way was granted to them by Congress. And in order to sell it to farmers, they participated in one of the great deceptions of American land history, which was that essentially rain would follow the plow. It may look droughty to you, settler, but in fact, once you put in your crops, the climate itself will change. It was an out-and-out lie.
And so consequently, they began to overcommit themselves to farming in this region. And then in the 1890s, the hammer came down. The rainfall stopped. The drought came. And when that happened, the result was economic and human disaster.
Farm life on the Great Plains is different than farming in the Midwest or points east.
They built sod houses, literally these mud huts, in which they cut bricks out of the sod. Or you could also burn it for fuel.
They had to develop, for example, new types of plows, steel-tipped plows of a certain shape that would cut through the sod more easily. Barbed wire that was developed in the 1870s in Illinois, a cheap and practical device to keep animals, grazing animals like cattle and horses, out of certain areas, especially away from crops and away from certain water sources. So, millions and millions of pounds of barbed wire began to be produced almost overnight.
Barbed wire conjures up yet another image from tales of the Old West. The hostility that is said to exist between farmers and cattle ranchers.
There was to some degree a natural competition between farmers and cattlemen, and for obvious reasons. These are two very different ways to use what was, after all, at the same time, one of the great natural pastures on the planet, and also some of the richest soil on Earth. In some ways, however, that competition is a little overdone. The Great Plains is best understood as a mixture of these two economies during these years. And furthermore, if you look at the plains as a whole, you'll see that there is a fairly clear division of how that land could be used. Toward the west is an area where only ranching makes sense. Farther to the east, where there's more rain, it really makes more sense to farm that area. So the conflict really, I think, is somewhat exaggerated.
By the late 19th century, American farming no longer resembles the comfortable image of independent farm families. In many cases, they've been replaced by the commercial farmer, who attempts to do in the West what industrialists are doing in the manufacturing economy.
The countryside that took shape in California at the beginning might have looked like any place of settlement in the far west or in the Midwest. People came in, they organized small farms, generally of mixed crops and livestock. By the 1860s, capitalists, people who had never been farmers, or people who certainly had never farmed on a large scale, came to the San Joaquin Valley, and they organized wheat fields on a truly remarkable scale. It was called bonanza wheat farming, that word meaning sky high or blue sky. These are wheat fields that were simply larger than anything anyone had seen before.
Cattle, beef, oxen, these animals required an enormous amount of feed. They could eat natural forage to a point, but they had to be supplemented with grains that were grown in the field, and also hay.
These commercial activities alter the look and feel of traditional agriculture.
It used a new breed of machinery that had been invented in California. Gang plows that would have 10, 20 horses pulling each one. Obviously, this required groups of men, homeless, migratory men, to harvest these crops. It took them a month, in some cases, to do this, camping, sleeping, eating in the field, sort of like the way that cowboys would move from Texas up to the railheads in Kansas, eating and sleeping along the way. This wheat, once harvested, went to the wharves in San Francisco, was loaded into some of the same ships that brought miners, and it was then carried around the Cape and then ultimately to Liverpool, England, which was its destination. There had never been a trade in an agricultural commodity that had gone this distance before. And it was undertaken by capitalists who were extraordinarily bold, who conducted this with very little insurance, but simply depended upon the economies that they realized in the production of the crop. The fact that the land was virtually free for the taking, the fact that they were never going to restore this land, and the fact that labor and transportation were relatively inexpensive.
Worldwide overproduction leads to a drop in prices for most agricultural products in the late 1880s. Farm families are painfully aware that something is wrong. But instead of blaming the glut of products on the market, they blame the railroad, the banks, and the government.
By the late 1880s and the early 1890s, the discontent among American farmers, especially on the Great Plains and in parts of the South, was rising to an extraordinary pitch. The basic cause was that the price of the things that they were growing were declining. And they were not able then to make enough money to pay their mortgages, to support themselves, to in some cases to feed their families. In the first place, paradoxically, farmers were suffering partly from their own success. The increase in the production was so great during these years that it simply outpaced the demand for those products. At the same time, the farmers themselves had made great economic commitments that now they were caught with. Their mortgage wasn't going down with the prices. The debts that they owed were not disappearing. The taxes they were paying were not changing. At an earlier time, many of these same farmers have been the first ones eager to commit themselves to those taxes by passing bond issues to try to attract railroads into their town, for example, by committing themselves to certain kinds of social and economic development that they thought would attract more settlement. But now, when the bad years came, they tended to turn on the railroads, the same railroads that they had tried to draw out onto the plains, to turn on the bankers who were holding their mortgages that these farmers had signed, to turn on the governments that were imposing taxes. This resulted in a social and a political upheaval on the Great Plains that was part of a larger feeling of discontent among other groups in the United States in the closing years of the 19th century.
And yet, in just a few short decades, the West has become bound up in the economic interests of the nation. The people of the West are not always satisfied with their role in this equation, but they are, nonetheless, essential to it.
The American West is becoming critical to capitalist development. It's seen as a place which supplies raw materials to the rest of the United States and will set in motion this boom-bust economy. The kinds of classic Western industries, or late 19th century industries, cattle ranching, timber production in the Northwest, mineral production outside of California and Idaho and the Homestake Mine in South Dakota, all of these things, New Mexico, Arizona. Wheat farming, the great wheat boom as they move into the Dakotas and on into eastern Montana, eastern Colorado. All of these things basically supply raw goods which will be refined and finished elsewhere. And Westerners begin to complain that they are being reduced to being hewers of wood and carriers of water for the larger economy. That in fact the capital that's necessary for industrialization, for the things that yield real wealth, go to the east. And there's going to be this constant complaint which will show up in Western political movements, will show up in the West's demand that if private capital is not going to develop the West, then the government should develop the West. That they are being left out of these larger trends. But in fact, it's one of the things that happens in the West is that you can't understand the late 19th century West without understanding this larger world economy. We think of it as people in log cabins out in the middle of nowhere, but in fact all of them are producing goods which are creating things which are going to be used all over the United States, on into Europe, into South America, beginning to penetrate the whole world economy. So the West is not some distant backwater. It's critical, but it sees itself as unequal and as colonized by the rest of the United States.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.